This is the Miyoo Flip. It's long awaited, and today we're going to take a look at it and answer the question, was it worth the wait? The Flip was originally leaked over a year ago, and over the past several months, whenever people reached out to Miyoo asking when the Flip would release, it was always next month. And then a month or so ago, we did get the version 1 of the Flip, but it had all sorts of problems with the hinge. So today I have the Miyoo Flip version 2. This is the gray model, which allegedly has had some hinge problems for some users, though I have not, and we'll get more into that later. But let's dive right in and see if this is too little too late, or if this is the coolest new little pocket pal on the market. Now it's time for a quick disclaimer. This unit was sent to me by the friendly folks over at MechDIY, and as always, they're not seeing this video, they don't have any input, and they're not telling me how to review it or what to say about the device, but I did receive it for free from them, so I'm not going to say that this is good if it isn't. I just want to let you know if you are actually spending the money, whether it's worth it or not. Second quick note, you'll see some weird stuff happening with the screen here, and unfortunately it seems like this screen is refreshing at a low rate, which is causing this. What we got here is a cute little clamshell harking back to the Game Boy Advance SP that some of us might have grown up with. The SP actually came out towards the end of high school for me. I didn't actually own one. I was still rocking my DMG because my parents didn't want to spend the money on a Game Boy Advance, but I did have a cousin and some friends that had the Advance SP, so I definitely have a little bit of nostalgia for it, though maybe not as much as people that owned it. But I think we can all appreciate a clamshell style device because it means the screen doesn't really need a protector. It's protected in your pocket, it's easy, it's portable. So let's, figure out if all those things add up to a winner here. As far as the specs go on the inside, we do have the tried and true RK3566 chipset. We've seen that in handhelds like the RGB30, 10 Max 3 from Powkitty, the Anbernic RG 353V and M. These are handhelds from the last couple years, and the 3566 was a relatively strong performer for a budget handheld towards the higher end of budget handhelds. So this is believe a hair stronger than the H700 in the Anbernic XX series, but for what I use it for, I don't know that that makes a huge difference. We see the return of the venerable 3.5-inch 640x480 screen. We've seen lots of these on the budget handhelds these days. Nothing to write home about, but it does get the job done. We've got 1 GB of RAM, our Linux-based OS, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, a 3000 milliamp battery, which is a bit on the smaller side compared to its peers with the same chip. Not by a huge amount, but some of those have higher 3000s or 4000s milliamp hours as far as the batteries go. And we've got our 2 TF card slots on the device, though I am only using one 64 GB card in slot 1 for the review today. As far as the price goes, from MechDIY, who did send this unit, quick disclaimer, it is about $86 with no card, but right now there is a site-wide code of, at the time of this filming, MC12, that's Mike Charlie 12. That brings it down to about $75 to $76, which is in line with the same prices that you might find it on somewhere like AliExpress. Given that it's the same price, I would probably recommend ordering from MechDIY just because of the enhanced customer service versus AliExpress, but you know what, I am not forcing you to buy it from any particular location. Let's take a quick tour of the device and see what's going on, starting with it in the closed position. At the top here, we can see we've got our bumpers, our USB-C port. I don't think this one charges, a micro HDMI out, a mini HDMI out. I always get them mixed up. I think that one's a mini. And we got our hinge mechanism here. On the bottom, we've got our 3.5mm headphone jack and our USB-C port. This one does support charging the device, though more on that later. And on the left side, we've got our volume rocker, our TF2 slot. And on the right side, we've got our TF1 slot and our power button. On the back, we have a couple little vents here and the labeling, some screws, and the top is pretty much just plain. Maybe a good spot to slap a sticker or decal on there if you're into that kind of thing. Opening it up, at the top, obviously, we've got the screen, our hinge, we've got the mode button, and then our standard controls. We have a mono speaker front and center here on the device. So that is pretty much it as far as the tour of the device. As far as how it feels, well, it is a decent quality plastic. I think that maybe the 35XX SP and some other handhelds, but I wouldn't say that this is necessarily toy-like. It's not quite Powkitty V90 levels of plastic. The finish is fine. It doesn't feel particularly rattly. So I'd say overall, it's fine. It's fine for what it is. I don't really have any complaints about the build quality in terms of the feel. Now, the question everybody's going to ask is this hinge going to break? If you'll notice, I'll bring it up a little bit closer here. There's a little bit more of a gap on the seam here, and it seems that the gray or DMG flavored Miyoo Flip 2 is a bit more prone to this, and there are a few videos floating around on the internet of people's hinges that have just failed. Now, I got this unit about 1 week ago from MechDIY, and all of my spare time, I've just been sitting here flipping this hinge back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and I haven't gotten it to break yet. I wanted to simulate owning this device for a couple months, a year, and how many hinge flips you might do. So I've just been abusing kind of the crap out of this, not like intentionally trying to hurt it, but just opening and closing it throughout the day. And so far, I have not had any breakage on the device, but the gray unit does seem to be more prone to that. So if you're concerned about it, maybe choose one of the other colors. If there is an issue, hopefully they will rectify that. Okay, so future Derek here. Right after I finished recording all of this video footage for the review today, I went to go eat lunch and I was fiddling with the Flip while I was eating just to see if I could stress test it a little more. I did escalate it up to probably a bit more aggressive than what an average person would do, but I took the Flip, held it by its body, and just kind of shook it back and forth and let the screen kind of open, close, open, close, open, close, and that footage is on the screen now so you can see what that looks like. And lo and behold, after I did that, it started developing some problems. The first thing I notice here is that the Flip will not close all the way anymore, so you can see a little bit of a gap when it's in the closed position. But secondly, something is deteriorating inside the hinge and plastics, and plastic and on plastic is screeching like nails on a chalkboard. So here's a couple clips of what that sounds like. Okay, so now that I've tortured you with that sound, I'm just going to say that you should be very cautious about picking up this unit, especially the gray one, as it appears that there may still be problems with the hinge unless you are very delicate and don't open and close it a lot. Again, I did abuse this slightly more than an average person would, but I don't think that I went out of my way to break it, so I still think it's fair to show this. So back to past Derek, as the rest of his opinions still matter. And as far as the hinge mechanism itself goes, it does have a pretty satisfying click, and we do get 3 positions. I think the 35XXSP only has 1 or 2, and we'll compare those later. But you get your first position at, I don't know, 125, 130 degrees, then maybe something like 160 degrees, and then a full 180. It clicks into those in a kind of detent, but you can also put it in an in-between spot, like say here 90 degrees, and there's enough friction that it doesn't really go anywhere, so you could play it like that, although 90 degrees is sort of an awkward angle. So yeah, it's fine. I don't really have too many complaints about it. It does sound a little sketchy when you're using it, but I think it is an improvement on the V-Run from the videos that I saw about that. Yeah, the hinge seems fine. It hasn't broken on me yet. If it does break on me, I will post a video and let you all know about that. All right, so let's move on to checking out the controls. I'll bring up the Hardware Tester app and we'll take a look at some of those. Let's start on the top here with the bumpers. These are similar if you've played with something like the 35XXSP. They don't rattle too much or really at all. They have a soft click, they're not noisy, and they kind of fall at the right spot under the crook of your finger and the tip of your finger. So I think overall, the shoulder buttons are absolutely acceptable on this device. Start and select are down here at the bottom. They're a little bit of a farther reach from here, but they are in the logical position here in order, so nothing really to say about those. They work perfectly fine. Moving on to the controls that you'll be using more often, let's talk about the D-pad first. So I would say that I actually do like this D-pad. I think it's a little bit thin. I wish these cross sections were a little bit meatier for using, but I don't find any issues with it. It has a membrane feel, but a nice tactileness to it. It is not clicky. It's not as loud as the 35XXSP, and it's not mushy either. Overall, I like it. You can see here, it takes quite a bit of wiggle to get a diagonal, so you're not going to really get too many false diagonals, but it's still pretty easy to hit a diagonal if you need to, and relatively easy to roll around. So overall, I would give this a grade A on the D-pad. Just the only thing keeping it from A+ maybe is being a little thicker on the cross sections. Similar things can be said about the buttons. These also have a membrane feel with a slight tactile click to them, but they are not dome or micro switch as far as I can tell. And they are pretty quiet as far as buttons go, so I really do appreciate these buttons. They're a little bit more flush. Maybe for some people that is not your priority, but I think that's pretty much how all clamshells are going to be. So yeah, I like the buttons on this. I like the D-pad on this. So for that kind of stuff, I think it gets a good review from me. Now, as far as the joysticks go, this is where it kind of falls apart a little bit more. I don't know if you can see here. Let me try to kind of zoom in. There is a bit of like snapping cardinally, which is somewhat to be expected on cheaper, smaller joysticks. and maybe the accuracy isn't the best. It's hard to tell with only the inbuilt tester here. But my bigger issue is just how like domed these are. Let me see if I can get a better view. They're very small and they're domed and they're not that grippy. So it's easy to kind of slide your finger, but then just accidentally release it. I mean, you can kind of dig into the corner, but that doesn't really work if you need to pivot it, or you have to press down kind of hard to keep it underneath your fingertip. So I think, I don't know. I guess if you do want to play some Nintendo 64, PSX, Dreamcast, that kind of stuff, then having the joysticks is a nice add. I probably won't use them much, but luckily they are out of the way. They don't really protrude at all on the device. So it's not like getting in the way of you playing with your D-pad and face buttons. They just exist and they're there if you need them. But I wouldn't play any heavy joystick-based games on this device if I were you. So kind of tying into that feel and the controls is the ergonomics of holding the device. I would say that, it's pretty small, so there's not a ton of purchase. I wouldn't kind of grip it like this. I would probably do it a more wide grip like this, just supported with my fingers on the backside here, but it's light enough that is not really fatiguing. And yeah, the D-pad and face buttons are in a decent position, and you can still get to these shoulder buttons. You might have to grip it a little bit more for a shoulder button intensive game, but overall I think for these controls it's fine. For a joystick based game, if you're going to use 2 sticks, then I would probably not enjoy playing this. But for buttons and 1 stick, it's passable. Again, I wouldn't buy this specifically for joystick games. I would just consider that an add-on bonus. I personally would be fine if it didn't have joysticks too, but I know some people would like them. And yeah, that does mean you can play some Nintendo 64 games better. So they're there in a pinch. But ergonomically, I would say it's what you should expect from a clamshell. I don't experience any major cramping, but it is pretty small, so maybe not the best extended play session for hours type device. But that's not really what I see the point of this device being. I see this as something that I can stick in my pocket or a bag, really quickly, and then just whip it out and open it and get to playing some games for a short session. And for that, I think the ergonomics are absolutely fine. So I don't want to do a ton of comparisons, but I did want to do the main comparison that you might be wondering about, which is the Anbernic RG 35XXSP. So let's get that out. All right, so here I have these sister handhelds, so to speak, the Miyoo Flip V2 on the right and the Anbernic RG 35XXSP. I believe this is the V1, which means the buttons are a little louder. I don't think there's a whole lot of major differences. So right away, you might be able to tell that the Flip is slightly smaller than the Anbernic. Height-wise, it's not a huge difference, but I will say that width-wise, you can see that the SP is definitely a wider unit. And if you look at the thickness, the SP is ever so slightly thicker, maybe by a couple millimeters. Not a huge difference, but overall it does lend the Flip to feeling slightly more portable and a little bit lighter. So it's definitely a little bit easier to fit in a pocket than the SP. However, the SP I think does have a little bit better plastic and build quality, although it does rattle a bit more with these shoulder buttons than the Flip does. So that kind of cheapens it a bit, but I do like the nice textured plastic that Anbernic has used on here. And as far as the hinge mechanism, I think the Anbernic is more robust in the way it's built with the split section here instead of just the small hinges on either side. However, the Flip does have the advantage of hinge points. So here is the Anbernic at, basically it can only do more than 180 and this sort of like 160 steep. There is no other detent. On the Flip, we get that kind of 160 degree angle on the 180, but we also get a third option at like about 130 degrees, which is kind of nice to have an extra option there. The hinges on both are sturdy enough that you can use a non-set angle and they'll still work fine, but that is what it is. As far as getting into the actual device here, I will say that, the SP does have a little bit nicer D-pad, but it's also louder and clickier, and the buttons are quieter on the Flip. And I think they might actually be slightly wider than the ones on the SP and a little bit more flush. I just generally think that the buttons do feel nicer to press on the Flip than they do on the SP. And then obviously you don't have joysticks on the SP at all. Other than that, they do share a lot of similarities in their form factor and size. One thing I do want to talk about though is the screen, and I'm going to kind of mix that into the comparison section here. So I'm just going to move the SP over for just a moment while we talk about the Flip V2. So the Flip V2 screen, it's 3.5 inches, 640 by 480, just like the SP and like 7,000 other handhelds that have released over the last few years. And at a size of 3.5 inches, 480p is just fine. Some integer scaling might not perfectly match up, but I think overall it's usable for most of the retro systems. However, I will say that this screen suffers in one main area, and that is brightness. I'm going to throw some pictures up on the screen that I took the other day. On my lunch break at work, I went outside to play the Flip. First, I sat at a table in the shade, and then I walked over to a park across the street, and it was a little bit sunnier, although it was still overcast outside, so it wasn't direct sun, but it was pretty bright sun, and you can see what that picture looks like here. Unfortunately, when you think about this device and its use case, which is kind of a portable, carry everywhere, flip out, play inline kind of device, which I think is what a lot of people want to use this for, that's fine if you're in line at the grocery store and you're going to flip it out and use it there. But if you're in line at an amusement park, or you're sitting at a park while your child is playing on the playground, or whatever it is that you're doing, it's unusable. You cannot see the screen well enough to play games, and that kind of kills it just a little bit for me for that use case. As far as the colors go, I think that the saturation and color are just fine. They are not OLED or anything like that, of course, but they get the job done. I just don't feel like it has the brightness to back it up if you go outside. So let me bring up a game on both screens and we can look a little bit more in depth at what the colors and everything look like. And as you can see here, brightness aside, the displays on both of these are relatively similar, though the Miyoo Flip has a noticeably cooler tone and the Anbernic has a much warmer tone. There were some games where I found that the Flip was a bit more vivid than the 35XX SP, and there are some saturation controls and everything built into the OS on the Flip, so you can tweak that a little bit. But overall, that's going to kind of come down to a preference. I think the Anbernic might skew a little bit too warm and the Flip might skew a little bit too cold, but either way, the displays are fine when you're not looking at them side by side. You probably wouldn't be able to tell a huge difference, other than that the 35XX SP can get noticeably brighter, so it's a much better choice for outdoor gaming. It's not still the brightest thing for outdoor, but it does beat the Miyoo Flip. So I think that's enough talk about both of these. Let's dive back into some more features on the Flip here. As far as the speaker goes, we've got this mono speaker here. It gets loud enough, not the loudest handheld in the world, but certainly plenty fine. However, it's just okay audio quality. I mean, it's serviceable for what it is. I really don't expect a lot out of these more budget handhelds and their single speakers. For retro stuff, it's probably perfectly fine, but let's just take a quick listen. All right, that's enough about that. Again, getting something through the microphone isn't always going to be the most accurate, but you know what? The speaker works, and that's kind of all I expect out of a handheld like this. So let's take a quick talk about the software and the OS on here. You do actually have two options to navigate. You can go through the default kind of game UI here, or you can actually hop into settings and set it to use Emulation Station as the default. You hit this and it will do a quick load, and then you will be greeted by a familiar UI that you have seen on systems such as Batocera, maybe your home PC, etc. Emulation Station is pretty ubiquitous, but you get that kind of UI. This is a better UI probably than the stock one if you want to use this more familiar interface. One thing that's sort of related to software is the version of this and charging. So when I first got this Miyoo Flip, I plugged it on the charger. It was in sleep mode, the screen was closed, and I came back a day later and the battery did not charge at all, and I was a little bit annoyed. So I went on to Discord and other places and asked about it. And I believe it turns out that the firmware version, I had a 2024, November or December, I forget, version of firmware on here. So I went to find the firmware, which was a bit of a chore because the Miyoo site didn't work, but I had to get a random link from somebody to a questionable site to download the software and update it. So that was a little bit annoying. Hopefully future units ship with the 2025 version of the firmware already on them so that you don't have to deal with that charging bug. It does seem to charge while closed now after updating it, although it's still kind of wonky and the indicator takes a while to update. I think the 3566 chip has a history of just being sort of weird with charging. So yeah, charge it from the bottom part, and I think you'll be okay as long as your software is updated. And then by default, when you go in here, it is running RetroArch under the hood. So let's just boot up a game and take a look at what that looks like as far as interface goes. So once you get into the game, you can hit the menu button by default, and that'll bring up this simple menu. You can save and load states, reset, exit, some basic stuff. But if you hit the option here that says native menu, then you will get into the full RetroArch menu, and you can change all of the settings you may know and love from RetroArch. I will note that on some of these by default, they've got overlays and shaders, which is kind of nice to have it configured by default. I guess they don't have anything for NES. But I did want to run into one issue with that, and let me explain that by booting up a Game Boy Color game. And that issue is related to my complaints about the screen earlier, which is the screen isn't very bright. By default, a lot of the systems like Game Boy Color have these grid shaders, which if you look at it right here, this looks pretty cool. It's got a little shadow around the edge, there's a fake bezel, and it looks nice. It looks great indoors, but outdoors, these grid shaders reduce the brightness on an already dim screen. So again, just comes back to me saying that outdoors is a really hard sell for me on this device, which again is really a bummer because it's so pocketable, compact, and svelte in your pocket. But if you try to whip it out while you're outside on a even moderately overcast or sunny day, then you're gonna have a bad time. As far as custom firmware for the device goes, we do have some upcoming options. I believe right now you can get MinUI working on the device, and Spruce OS, which is sort of an overlay over the stock OS, which makes it look nice and have some additional features as featured on the Miyoo A30 in the past. I think that's currently in alpha. Even the devs said they don't really recommend installing it right now, but it is out there and getting cooked up. And that'll probably be the best option if you want a similar to stock experience with some enhancements on it. I personally do like using MinUI a lot just because it gives you that really simple interface on the device, but some people like having all of their artwork and advanced settings accessible more so than you can in MinUI. So yeah, just another option. It's great to have multiple options for custom firmware. I believe Noli might be in testing, which is sort of a Batocera based Linux firmware for this. And then there is Gamma OS available for this chip. I believe it's probably Gamma OS Core, which is Android. The 3566 chip does have Android support. Now that's pretty cool because that means that you can put some Android games on here, do game streaming if you want to be crazy and stream to this tiny little thing, or some native Android games. And I think N64 emulation has a little bit more performance in Android than in Linux. So there's a couple reasons you might want to do Android, but there's a lot of reasons you might not, because this is not a touch screen, and using Android on a non-touch device kind of sucks a lot. I do not like using non-touch Android devices. Now, to give the Gamma Squeeze credit, he's amazing, and he's made the interface for Android way more tolerable without a touchscreen using Gamma Core. So major props to him for his development work. So if you want to do Android, that's an option. But still, personally, I just don't like Android enough without a touchscreen to deal with it. As far as how all of this performs, well, we know this chip, so I'm not going to do a bunch of in-depth performance testing because frankly, that's boring and you've seen it before in other videos. What we know about the 3566 is that you're going to be up to PSX, PlayStation 1 and Nintendo DS just fine. It's going to play those in any system older than those perfectly fine. I even played some PSX on here, and I can even boot that up and show you with the enhanced graphics settings, which is like a double resolution, which is actually the default setting on here, and there were no performance hiccups at all using that. So I think PlayStation 1 is actually a really cool proposition for this device because you do have the joysticks in a pinch for those games that need the DualShock style controller, but it is still a nice little compact thing. So yeah, I think that up to PlayStation 1, that is the sweet spot here. Nintendo 64 is where it starts to break down a little bit, that there may be some games that aren't going to play as well as others, but there's still a lot of playable stuff on Nintendo 64. I didn't really test Dreamcast a lot on this one because it's not really a super nostalgic system for me, but I did test a little bit of PSP, and let's put that up on the screen in just a second here and talk about that. So I'm just going to go ahead and say it. You probably shouldn't play PSP on this. I mean, okay, there's probably some 2D and puzzle games that run just fine, but you're either stretching it to the full screen or having a narrow area. And if you can see here for God of War, which is a slightly more demanding 3D game that I'm sure you've seen in plenty of tests, look up at the top right there. I am getting like 21 frames per second. It's heavily relying on frame skip to make this in a playable state. You wouldn't want to play it without frame skip on, and even with it on, yeah, 20 frames per second is not a super enjoyable experience. I mean, it is playable technically. So if you really, this is your only console and you want to play some PSP on it, go for it. But you probably shouldn't buy this for PSP. There are much better options out there for that form factor. And, you know, something like the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, while a bit more expensive, and, you know, Retroid Pocket 4 and 5, of course, as well, but at a higher price. Those are all much better suited to PSP with their 16:9 form factor and more powerful processors. Something like the RG556 is also a great option for something like PSP. But yeah, PSP probably wouldn't expect a ton out of it. With some tweaks in the right games, I'm sure it's playable, but for my standards, which is I like to just have stuff run at its native frame rate without a bunch of hacks, this is not going to be the device for that. Now, let's talk about heat real quick because it's got a little bit warm playing God of War. There is just some general warmth kind of a little bit on the back here, but mostly right in this area above the speaker, and it's not hot. It's definitely not uncomfortable or anything particular concerning. There is just a little bit of warmth emanating from here. Slightly related to warmth and heat is battery life. And what I can tell you is that I actually kind of lost track while I was doing my battery test. I was running a Super Nintendo game. I believe it was Super Star Wars. And I just had it on the menu, which was scrolling through a bunch of different cutscenes from the games. I'm not sure, that might be slightly less demanding than actually playing since you're not clicking buttons, but I at least want to get a general idea. And I started that test at 11 a.m. and it died sometime between 6 and 8 p.m. Problem was, I think around 6:30 or so, I started making dinner and I had it on the table next to where I was and just kind of lost track. I probably died at around 7 p.m., which was about 8 hours of battery life for something less demanding like Super Nintendo or below. So I think that's perfectly fine for a device of this size. It's not going to win any marathon categories, but at least it's not dying in just a couple hours. So yeah. So I think that wraps up what I have to say about the Miyoo Flip today. My thoughts are that at around $75, it's not the cheapest, though it's about the same price as you're going to find similarly classed devices like the 35XXSP or other older RK3566 chip devices. Something like the RGB30 is a similar new price on the market. So I would say that, you know, price-wise, I guess it makes sense. But would I buy it if I had spent my own $75 on it? Hold on, I'm gonna let you finish that thought, but future Derek here. No, I don't think I would buy it right now just because of how many Hinge issues we're seeing. If you are gonna buy it, don't buy the gray model, but I'm gonna get back to the rest of my thoughts as they still apply. And if you're more gentle with your device, you might not break it like I did. But yeah, future Derek, a little hesitant on buying this one. I do really like the form factor, and I love that it can just slip into my pocket. This would easily win me over alone on that portability and travel aspect. However, the screen brightness, I know it sounds like I'm nitpicking here, but that thing is a huge bummer for me because I do go outside a decent amount and touch grass occasionally. I have a kid and we'll go to the park and I'll whip out a retro handheld while she's playing on the playground and I'll bust out a quick session. I'm not going to be able to do this. Maybe if I'm sitting underneath a tree in some deep shade and I squint a little bit, I can see the screen, but it's not really going to work out that great. When I'm at home, I'm typically grabbing a larger device, so something small like the Flip here doesn't necessarily make as much sense for me. So that's really where I'm at on this device. If you really want a clamshell and you're not going to play outside a lot, I do think that this has more comfy controls than the RG35XXSP, and it fits in your pocket better. If you're going to travel other places that are indoors and you just want something that you can fold down, toss into your bag, toss into a pocket, then yeah, this is probably a pretty awesome option. And of course, there is the hinge issue that's a concern. I think only the retro gray units have shown any issue so far from the videos I've seen, and none of the other colors. So I don't know, maybe this is a wait and buy and make sure that more people don't have problems with the hinges. But that's really all I got to say about it today. So thanks for tuning in. Remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more content from me and to just kind of help me out. But other than that, you guys have a good one. And yeah, see ya.